Thanks very much for the warm welcome. Can you guys hear me all right? All right, you can hear me now. Okay, thank you so much. This is your product's life. Many of you are probably familiar with this product lifecycle chart. Many of us have probably gone through that uphill grind and the uphill battle and the grind to get that initial traction and growth. Who's been there? Now, in reality, that's actually a small portion of the entire life cycle. The MVP that everyone talks about, that's so popular, that takes up books and books and books to explain, that happens right here, right at the introduction of your product. However, most companies aren't building greenfield products that haven't launched before, that don't exist. Most of us are working on products that we've adopted from some other product manager that exist already in the market. Does that describe you? All right. So it already has a pile of existing customers and constraints. You've already got some tech debt built in there. That wasn't your fault. That just happened. You've probably got a messy backlog that you've adopted, full of features and ideas and suggestions, some of which haven't been looked at for years, and you're never going to be able to fully work through that. So if you look at the volume of sales, this is where most of the money is made in this maturity stage. And yet it's also where churn really, really starts to hurt. See, when you're a small company, particularly in this high growth, frothy market, it's actually easy to mask a bad churn rate just by throwing more money at it and growing. But once you've saturated the market, that's where your churn problem really starts to kick in. This is where it really starts to bite back. And yet, if you look at what people talk about on Medium and elsewhere, way more articles are written about getting that initial traction and that initial growth. There's a lot less shared about this maturity stage, or God forbid, the decline stages of your product. Which is a shame, because this is exactly where it starts to get hard. So in the growth stage, your team is much more focused on getting product market fit, proving that this product deserves to exist in the market and can get that initial traction. At the maturity stage, you've got existing customers and new customers to deal with. You've got these built-in constraints and all the technical complexities. Satish from Shopify this morning talked about how you get further from that problem. You get new customers who have different ways of tackling that problem. This is what happens when your company starts maturing, when your product starts maturing. So with maturity comes problems. For example, you might find that you've become a feature factory. Now, this is actually born out of a habit that seems really good when you're young. You're agile, your cadence is huge, your velocity is off the charts. You're getting new features out every day, and each new feature gets you the next 100 downloads or sales or signups or whatever it is. You're speeding ahead, separating yourself from the competition. These new features are great, but at the same time, they're a little bit addictive, and you end up becoming this type of company who focuses on launching new features, and over time, new features don't add value. As a matter of fact, they start adding way more complexity than you're actually getting out of it, and you end up with a Frankenstein of a product. Because at the end of the day, a whole bunch of features doesn't necessarily make a great product. So those old habits of being agile and having great cadence and release cycles doesn't necessarily work for you. It's actually led you astray. And so you should be focusing on objectives instead of features. Now, inherently, teams understand this. They know that a big pile of features doesn't necessarily make a great product. And yet it's a pattern that I see over and over and over again. Personally, I blame the roadmap. Now, the roadmap isn't an inherently bad document, a feature item. They're actually great for communicating your company strategy and making sure everyone's pointing in the right direction. But a badly done roadmap can pave the way to this feature-filled product death. So I implore you all to do this with me today. Ditch your timeline roadmap. So I know this format makes you look good today. Your bosses and your board, they certainly love this level of certainty as to what's coming up. But it's setting you up for failure. Because if you deconstruct this format of the roadmap, it's basically a chart. You're mapping out things to do versus time. And time is on this x-axis, creating this timeline for you. And at first, it's pretty easy and intuitive to use, especially in the short term. But the further out you plan and the more you put on there, the harder it becomes to manage. And because that timeline sits at the top, everything you put on the roadmap implicitly has a due date and some duration that you've put on there, just by the format of the fact that it's this chart that you've got there. And as a result, you end up with a big pile of features, a big pile of drop-dead deadlines, and it's all piled on top of a big bunch of assumptions that you've made. So the first assumption you've made is that you know how long each of these different things is going to take to build. Now again, this works well if you've been able to talk to your developers and come up with estimates for what's coming out in the next sprint. But the further out you go, the more you're actually just making it up and adding buffer and making it more complex that way. You're also assuming that nothing else is going to come in and change your plans. No new competitors, no new features from feature requests from customers, no changes in the market. Basically, nothing's going to change. And you're also assuming that each of these features are going to work as soon as they launch. So let's say you allotted 3 weeks to build that new checkout page. Great. So at the end of 3 weeks, it's going to be working and converting exactly as expected, right? Right. And so by explicitly adding these features to the timeline, you're also assuming that each of these features actually deserve to exist, that they form part of some strategy and deserve to be codified. And at the end of the day, you're making one big assumption, and that is that nothing is going to change. And we're product managers. We know that things always change. So what could go wrong? Well, you end up with these made-up release dates that send your developers on these stressful marches to hit this deadline you made up. You've got your sales and your customer people getting excited about these features that may or may not launch on time. You're missing opportunities and often just building the wrong thing, things that you assumed were right 12 months prior. And this leads to you often being a sad product manager. We don't want any of this, so is there a better way? Of course there is. I'm going to show you 3 steps to get yourself out of this feature factory. First step, start with your vision. If you don't have one of these agreed and written down and posted on your wall somewhere, get back there, get back to the drawing board and start here. This is a format that I like using. You guys actually might recognize it from Crossing the Chasm, Jeffrey Moore book from a long time ago now. It's actually a great format for the roadmap because it asks questions like, who are you building for and what sets you apart? And then map out your objectives. And this is actually a hugely important step that a lot of companies end up missing. Seema mentioned this one from Wattpad. She mentioned this earlier about having that agreed set upon metric or numbers that everyone's pointing towards. Now you might know these as KPIs or OKRs. I simply just call them objectives. It doesn't matter what we call them, it's just what works for your team, but they act as guardrails and keep everyone pointing in the same direction so they know how their success is being measured. The important thing is to focus on outcome over output. Output is something we've been traditionally measured on, like measuring how many features we get out the door or how many story points or what our velocity is. Measuring outcomes means tying things back to the original company level goals. And so finally, change out that timeline, ditch that timeline and change it out for these time horizons, these 3 buckets. In this first bucket, you've got things that are much more granular, fixed in scope. These are things that are keeping your team busy today with prototyping, testing, being built out. But the future column is much less about these specific initiatives and more about problems that you think you need to solve in order to fulfill that vision. And the key thing is that everything on your roadmap is meant to be an assumption to be validated. That's a really key point because your roadmap at the end of the day is a tool to help you validate. It's a prototype for your strategy. You know, if you were building a new feature, you might draw up a napkin drawing with, ideas as to where the button might go and what the copy might be, and you'd show it to a customer, and they'd come back and tell you whether they like it or not, and you'd crumple it up and start again with a fresh piece of paper, and work your way through, using it as a basis for conversation so that you start building towards the right thing. Your roadmap is exactly that, but at the strategic level. It's a document that's meant to facilitate and kick off the conversation rather than creating this perfect plan and promise of what you're actually going to do. And so put these 3 things together, your vision, your objectives, and these time horizons, and you end up with a lean roadmap. Now, each of these blocks that I've got in this roadmap here are initiatives or problems to be solved. Each one's linked to a specific objective. So here's one popular configuration. Another one might look more like this, sort of in that streams where everything's grouped by objective. Just depends on what works for you and your team. The key thing is that it's the value of this roadmap format is that it takes the focus off building individual features and sets everybody towards solving problems. And speaking of problems, nothing stifles innovation like a to-do list as long as your arm. This is a state that so many teams get stuck in. Every all-in-one backlog has this to-do list that is just bloated, it's massive, it's vertigo-inducing, and it stresses out the development team who's looking down the barrel of like a million different undefined tasks, things to be done, some of which aren't even good ideas. And it freaks out the rest of your non-tech team who are just wondering why none of their ideas ever seem to see the light of day. So the solution to this is actually quite simple. It's to break your backlog up, separate the strategic side of it from the execution side, or as I like to think about it, as the product backlog versus the development backlog. So the development backlog is meant to be this itemized list of things to be done. These are spec'd out, ready to go, approved specs, detailed enough that you could hand to a developer and they could run with it. This allows them to be autonomous when they're picking out what's coming up in their upcoming sprints, but still gives you this visibility as to what kind of things are going into development. It's relatively short and tidy and shouldn't stress out the developers. This is a list of things to do. So this is where execution happens. But the other side is the product backlog, and this lives separately because this is a list of all the feature requests, insights that you've gotten from the prototypes and the experiments that you've run, ideas coming in, top-level new findings that you've put in there. It should be transparent. It should be something that the rest of the team can see and can pitch ideas into. They can see what kind of things are being considered and how they link up to the overall company objectives. So this backlog, the product backlog, is key to the strategic side of thinking. So split your backlog into these two parts. Separate the strategic from the execution to avoid having one of those scary all-in-one beasts of a backlog. And as your product matures, experimentation starts getting a lot scarier. Now, we probably all know this build, measure, learn diagram. This is quite famous from the lean startup TM world. And it looks simple. It is simple, right? Where it's just build, measure, and learn, right? Just go do that. But it works until you've got competition nipping at your heels. You've got a growing base of customers who are asking for more and more and who are changing with every quarter. And you've got this tech debt creeping in at the edges. Your company enters panic mode. They start shoveling features and fixes out the door, and they neglect to do anything but the build part. And it usually happens at the expense of the other parts, like actually measuring and learning. And they end up in this build, build, build cycle, also known as the build trap. Now, you can get out of this trap. You just need to create the time and the space to make this validation happen. Most teams know this. They know that they need to be doing some measuring and some building, but they don't feel that they have the time or the permission to stop building and actually get out there and figure out whether they're building the right sort of stuff. So you can avoid the build trap, for example, by doing some form of dual track agile. Now, this comes in many different flavors. I'm not going to get dogmatic about which one works for you, but the essence is that you're giving as much time focused to the discovery end of things as you are to the delivery end of things. So you've got a discovery track that starts out by testing and figuring out what kind of things are going to work, and the winning experiments end up in the delivery track so that they can be built for your production and deployed all around. Gibson's talk sort of touched on this, where he had these A/B tests that were happening beforehand, and then this decision point as to whether it actually goes out to everybody else. Do this in a constant back and forth cycle, whether you've got one team going back and forth or two teams owning different tracks. But having a dual track approach, if done properly, gives you the best combination of speed and learning. And I see this bad habit all the time. So let's say you've released something. You close all the tickets in Jira. That's great. You wipe down the whiteboard. You crumple up the Post-it notes that are stuck to the wall, and you start working on the next thing. But what happened to that thing that you just launched? I mean, it might seem good for keeping up cadence and keeping everything clear, but it's really bad for ensuring that you're actually making an impact. So just because something was launched doesn't mean that it actually solved the problem you meant it to, and you're not going to know that immediately. This is something you need to go back at and review as you go. So the lean roadmap format can actually help you with that. As I mentioned, each of these cards is meant to be a problem to be solved. And so you can actually link or add your experiments to these cards and keep it in this really visible place, saying, if we're going to solve problem X, then these are the 5 experiments we're trying, and here's the progress of each of those. Use this as a place to track what kind of things you're learning, and so that even as things are being built, you can bring that back in and add new experiments or change things before it leaves the roadmap. So it just makes it visible to everybody as to what kind of things are being done to help solve the problems that you've outlined as part of your strategy. And once a project is done in development, done, and the developers say it's done and it's been launched, don't just throw out these results. Track it somewhere separate. We have what we call a validation roadmap, which is basically this reverse chronological list of things that have been launched, tracked against the actual outcome that came out of them. And this can live on the roadmap or separate to the roadmap, but just make sure that it actually lives. Give it a place, give it a home, make sure people know where to find it, and make sure that you go back and revisit it a week after you launch, a month after you launch, 3 months after you launch, and just check. Did the churn rate stay low after you launch something, or was it a blip? Did the conversion rates go up? Did they stay up, or did nothing happen? And the whole point of it is to show your work. Product managers have historically been judged based on how many features we get out the door, because that's what the execs can see. When in reality, we want to be judged based on the types of problems we solve. And part of that is admitting when something wasn't solved very well and pointing out what we learned from it so we can apply that to the next cycle of experiments that we run. So this validation is built into your roadmap, and it creates a space where you can show the value of the work that's actually being done by you and your fellow product team. And it helps to remember that it's not your job to have all the answers. As a product person, you're supposed to know less than your colleagues. Instead, focus on asking the best questions and create this safe space for everyone to contribute. To really excel with experimentation, you need to build psychological safety. And what this means, really, it's about making people feel comfortable speaking up and reporting failures and errors, pitching in to help out with the product. Now, how do you build this psychological safety within your own team? Well, there's a couple little language hacks that I use to help create this safe space. One of my favorite phrases is to begin questions with, how might we? It turns the issue into a collective problem. It supposes instead of asserts, and it works really well in conjunction with, I bet. Because as a product manager, you're going to be wrong a lot. I bet gives you permission to fail and to try again. After all, it wasn't you that was wrong, it was your bet. And now that you know what doesn't work, you're free to move on to the next thing. So it's subtle, but changes in your language like these actually help create this safe space for everyone to get involved in pitching ideas, pitching experiments, and feeling safe when they're actually running into these experimentation challenges. And as any product matures, if you've got any sort of traction, any sort of press or market share or revenue, money, attention at all, you can almost guarantee that it looks pretty tasty to new startups who are getting involved. As soon as you have any level of success, be ready because somebody is coming to disrupt you. I like to think about companies on this sort of risk appetite scale. You've got on this end, the super nimble and lean. These are 2 founders who started this thing up in a coffee shop on Tuesday. They've got the lean startup book under their arm and they're ready to go. On the other side, you've got the super slow moving ships, right? These government regulated, stakeholder run big companies that simply can't change. Now, most companies fall somewhere in between here, but the most successful companies are the ones who have the cash cow products and are moving towards it slow and risk averse, because that's where the money's made, But they actually find ways to disrupt themselves and to carve out time to become more nimble and lean. No company exists at either end of this, and some companies actually exist in multiple places along here. Let me show you what I mean with that. Here's a few tactics I've seen. The Google. Google is pretty famous for their 20% time. They give the equivalent of a day off a week to go work on whatever it is you want to. Now, I know they've iterated on this and it's changed a little bit, and frankly, 20% of everyone's time is a lot of money to put towards this sort of R&D. But things like Gmail and Maps have come out of this. Now, 20% might be too much for you, but can you try 2%? Not 0.2%. Just see what comes out of it. It might become the new profitable line. The hackathon is one of my favorites. It's just as good for team building as it is for potentially making new products that could to help your product portfolio. So give your team a time-boxed week of freedom. Put together a simple product. It very well may become the next big thing. Or at the very least, you'll learn something along the way. The lab is an approach that's used by typically larger companies, usually those ones going through their digital transformation. The lab, it's a small division as part of a larger company, and it looks and acts like a startup, but has the backing of the company parent. So anything that's good that comes out of it allows you to, any prototype that comes out of it, they have the parent backing, and they can accelerate that product much faster than a brand new startup with no money can do. So it can be a powerful force. And finally, the Facebook. Now, Facebook has one of the largest user bases in the world, but they never launch something to everybody at the same time. In fact, what they do is they segment their users into tiny groups and test and release new features with just this subset. They could probably launch something just to the people in this room today, which is freaky, and we don't expect everyone to be able to do that, but there are tools out there to allow you to do dark launches or segments launches, and that way you can kind of test the crazy stuff, see what works and doesn't work, and then roll it out to everybody else. So these are some tactics that can help your company disrupt its own maturing product line before it enters the decline stage. Your goal is to breathe new life into your maturing product by either adding more value or expanding into other markets. If done right, you can actually extend your product's life and expand your revenues even further. So, beat the feature factory by ditching that timeline and focusing on solving real problems. Conquer that beast of a backlog you have by separating out the strategic from the execution side. Learn to love experimenting again by building in a safe place for validation. And disrupt yourself before someone else gets there and does it for you. And that is how you can grow up lean. And I think we're doing all right for time and questions.
We're going to take some questions.
Great. We've got one right up front here.
Could we have a mic up here? I think it'd be lovely so we can all hear the question. Thank you, Janna.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Can you tell us a bit about how you thought of all of these things and sort of your background, just a little bit, like how do you
how I came
up with all of this? Thank you.
I failed spectacular in a whole bunch of different random ways. I was a product manager. I fell into it completely by accident. There was no school for product management, and I was given the title before I even knew what it was. Anybody else get here by accident? All right. Okay, that number is going down every year, which is a good thing. I'm going to move around because it might be me causing that. Is that better? Okay. So my background is as a product manager. I've been working in product. My first version of the software that I build now is actually an Excel spreadsheet of a Gantt chart timeline roadmap. And I use this. My bosses loved it. It made me look great. Until like 6 months later when I couldn't deliver on anything, because that is frankly what happens. And it wasn't until I made this available to a bunch of other people. I actually posted it online saying, here's how to do a roadmap. People downloaded this thing, they loved it, and they'd come back 6 months later pointing out that it was failing them. that they just wanted to take everything on that roadmap and move it over by a month every month. And so I could have just added features to it, like allow people to move everything over, but instead I broke it apart and figured out why people were suffering with this. And I realized that this addiction to getting new features out and this addiction to having this clarity of exactly when things are going to be launched was forcing people to add more and more buffer and to cut out scope and quality and to focus on building what they thought was a great idea 1 year prior, instead of actually listening to their market and reacting to it. So I ended up having to change my entire process, and this was the result. I'm very lucky I've had the chance to work with literally thousands of product people and hear what's worked and what hasn't worked, and so I've been building this into my thinking over the course of the last 8 years or so. Thank you.
So you talked about the two backlogs, the product backlog and the development backlog. I'm on the customer support side, and we often have this debate. Is it the same team that works on both backlogs? Do you separate them? Do you have any insight into what you would recommend?
Yeah, sure. I can tell you how we've set it up, because we have that same sort of dichotomy of bugs and issues coming in and trying to support that. We have things that people report that are bugs. They're just tasks to be done. They're replicatable. Whether or not we think they're important or not, they go into our development backlog because it's just a thing to be done. And the development team gets to choose as to what % of their time or how many story points or whatever they want to spend on fixing bugs, fixing tech debt versus new features. But we leave that up to them because these are concrete, ready-to-go things. New features, we don't just build something because one customer's asked for it. We sit on this. We get back to everyone who's ever asked for anything and say, hey, cool, we're going to think about that. And then we put it somewhere. We put it in a customer feedback backlog. We link it to ideas and put it on a roadmap and think about how this is going to play out. And when we're ready with those, once we've turned them into actual product specs in our backlog, in our product backlog, only when they're approved, ready to go for a developer to pick up and work on, do we send it over to our Trello instance. So we use Trello, other teams use Jira. It's whatever works best for your development process. We put things in the Trello board alongside the bugs, and the developers get to pick and choose from there. But we also have a QA board as well, because what we have are sometimes bugs that we know exist, but we can't replicate. And so we keep that in a separate area, which is much more for the QA team to kind of dig through and figure out what works and doesn't work. And once they're able to replicate it and it's a to-do, it's a task, that goes into the development backlog. So the only things that ever live in the development backlog are things that are ready to go to the point where a developer with no boss telling him what to do can pick something up and know that he's working on more or less the right thing. Whereas the product backlog is where the rest of the team lives and understands, like, what are these sort of problems people are saying? What are the trends we're seeing? What kind of integrations do people want, or what should we work on next? That lives in the product backlog itself.
A comment. I've come to many of the similar types of theories in terms of doing product development that you guys have had, and you didn't really do it, but check out the product, check out the website, because they've institutionalized this, and it's great. One of the things that you didn't mention in there that I'd like to add to the group, if they don't feel that this is worthwhile, is that it allows you to do a lot more with a much smaller team, because the team can be very focused. So for example, for us, following these very similar types of methods, we have a very small team that punches well above our weight, and people don't realize how small we are because of the workflow. Thanks.
Magic, thank you.
Any other questions? Great.
Got one back
we do.
there. Hi.
Thank you. Hi. So I was wondering, where does, do you think there would be a separate design and UX backlog, or is that really wrapped into product? Or how do you work with designers and UX people?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it depends on the team and whether your designers are sitting next to you or whether it's some external agency. I err on the small side where our team sits with us. And so the product flow kind of comes around where it's like, we've heard this feedback, we want to test this idea, and so we'll do a little bit of a spike. Maybe we'll make a quick prototype and show it to some people. Maybe we'll run some surveys. Depends on the actual issue itself, depends on what kind of problem we're trying to solve. But we very much get our product designers or UX designers involved in that process, and actually have a team that's dedicated, I say team, a person, dedicated towards making prototypes of this stuff, showing it to people, and then making sure that the final prototype matches as much as possible what we want to put in production. So we're very careful about not launching or throwing in unfinished specs to development. We'd much rather spend more time in the product process, figuring out how we're going to solve this problem, even to the point of making HTML and jQuery prototypes just to show that it works and this is how it's going to work, this is how it's going to look like, before we send it on to development to be built. And that saved us a lot of effort and a lot of iterations that we would have otherwise had to do in production code, which is about as expensive as it gets.
Great.
All right.
Thank you, Jenna. I'm just
you very
going to point something out on the slide for a second. I know that people, there was great content. There's the link to the slides.
Oh,
if
yes.
anyone wants to see that.
Link to the slides. And also, if anybody wants, I've got a handful of these handy guides for product people here today. I know you guys were taking pictures of things like the product vision template and stuff like that. It's got it all in here. So happy to share these around. I've got maybe a dozen, so come see me. Thank you.
That's a big hand. That was fantastic. Thank you.